I want to welcome Annie Duke, but I'm going to do that by giving some background as how I met Annie. She originally was on our radio show as, of course, a World Series of Poker champion, one of the world's great poker players. And she came to my Wharton Moneyball Academy class where she dazzled our students and was the favorite and the most highly sought after to repeat. And she does an incredible thing. She began her career as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania.
Right next door.
Right next door. Then went to become a professional poker player. And she has written a book called Thinking in Bets, which I have read, and it is excellent, and I recommend it. And she's also started a foundation called the Alliance for Decision Education, which is designed or is hoping to try to change the way we teach decision making and actually probability and statistics, if you will, in the elementary, middle, and high schools. And I'm actually very, very interested in that. So welcome to Wharton again, Annie Duke.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's terrific. I'm going to begin by asking you sort of a crowd, I think, a question that most people want to know, which is how you got into poker. But while you're answering that question, I want you to think about two other sort of underlying issues, which is, for example, what in your background suggests that poker might have been something that you would do, and also what in your background suggests that poker might be something that you would be really good at?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I just want to say I retired from the game in 2012, so imagine if I tried to play against the best players in the world, I'd actually be quite poor right now. I'm out of practice, and the game has changed a lot, actually in similar ways to the way that professional sports has played. So the amount of information and the ability to run analytics and Monte Carlos and so forth is very different than when I was playing. So maybe I could get up to speed, maybe I couldn't, I don't know, I haven't tried. So let me think about that question. So first of all, just how I got into poker. Let me start with the first part of it. So I was just across the way here in the psychology department doing my PhD work, specifically on learning. And in this particular case, I was really focused on how children learn their first language, which is no small feat. It's actually quite a complicated problem to try to figure out. And I had all of my job talks lined up. And I was ready to go out and become a professor, and I got sick. So the answer is I started playing poker because of the intervention of luck. And one of the things that I think about in terms of this illness that I experienced, which I was in the hospital and I had to delay my job talks for a year, is that the lesson that I took from that is that very often when luck intervenes in your life, you actually don't know whether it will be good or bad, except in retrospect.
So just to point you more directly, if I got sick in graduate school and didn't end up becoming a professor, happens, I doubt I'd have become a professional poker player. So how did that, of all the possibilities?
Right, so that's the interesting thing. So I was intending to go back out on the job market. So now I'm a little constrained in what I can do during this year off. Mm-hmm. So I didn't want to start a new career because I was going to go become a professor. And also it was going to be hard for me to have a 9-to-5. Because I was still recuperating, and right. So who knew? So my brother, when he was 18 years old, went off to New York, and he was studying with a chess grandmaster. My brother was a master and had hopes of becoming a grandmaster. And this was in the 80s. In the games world, backgammon, chess, poker, it's all very intertwined in New York. And so he sort of got into backgammon and poker kind of through chess. And at first, he was quite poor at it. In fact, he lost his college money. I know, it's kind of funny in retrospect. No, playing poker.
Playing poker, okay.
Yeah, but then he started to sort of unlock the game, and he actually was a very good player. So while I hadn't really played any poker before, I had this brother who was already playing sort of at the top levels of the game. And so when I was saying to him, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do during this year, he said, well, why don't you just try poker on for size? And I'll give you some lessons, and you can try it out until you go back out and become a professor. So that was my full intention that time. So it just turned out, as I started playing, that I had a knack for it. Mm-hmm. I was making a bunch of money. But more important than the money was that as I was thinking about what were the problems that I was trying to tackle in terms of how children might learn their first language, funnily enough, what was sitting down at the poker table was really actually trying to solve a very similar problem. And it was just like, basically, I fell into this really, really practical version of the kinds of problems that I had been trying to figure out in my graduate work. And I just loved it. It was like the heavens sort of opened up, and I was like, this is really cool. This is actually a really cool gateway into actually kind of really understanding some very deep things about the way that humans learn and trying to figure out how to solve those things for myself.
So you're actually telling us that perhaps your education in graduate school was good preparation to become a professional poker player?
So I think it was, but you know, it's so funny because obviously here people know a little bit more, but when people would hear that I was getting my PhD in psychology, everybody thinks clinical psychology.
Oh, I don't.
Right. But people outside of this
Right.
room do, and so people were like, aha, so you really knew, you really knew people's personalities, and like, and I was like, no, not really. What for me it was really recognizing what's the role of uncertainty in the way that you learn, what is it that you're learning from outcomes, how do you actually kind of like work around a lot of the human biases that can really block learning, that make this kind of learning under uncertainty really hard. And then there was this other component that was separate from what I was doing in graduate school, which was just if you know that your amygdala is going to get lit up. In other words, if you know that you're going to be in something which is very high pressure, where there's a lot of emotion involved, if you can kind of crack that nut, then you're going to be much better off than the people that you're playing against. And the way that I used to think about it was, if I'm better at figuring out what I'm supposed to learn from what's happening at the table, and I can keep my emotions under control, then I can play against somebody who has a lot more talent than I do. And I will do better than them. Because yes, if they're playing their A game, they might really have a big edge against me, but they're mostly not going to be playing their A game. So someone who's sort of, you know, in that A- range all the time is going to be better than somebody who maybe has an A but swings to a C a lot.
So I'm going to go back to my earlier question and wonder whether you actually indirectly may have answered it. How did you become, or were you always good at keeping your emotions in check? If you think about it, you've just described that as a very important component of playing against particularly better players. Is this something you trained yourself to be able to do, or do you think that was a skill that you either, it's a family trait, or was it learned, or?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So when I was very little, the answer is no. I was not good at it. I used to play cards against my dad and my brother a lot, and I think that this was obviously some training for this. So I was really understanding, like, how do you make decisions when there's hidden information and luck, from the time I was like 4. But my brother was older than I was, and my father was, you know, an grown adult man. So I did not win very much. And trust me, there were cards flying across the room a lot. So I was not handling that loss very well. But I think that as I kind of went along in that, I sort of had to figure that out. Like, how do you not get just so addled by losing? I think that the thing that I had going for me that kind of allowed myself to get that under control is, and I know from other people who were marking on my brother and my sister and me, that I think that as a family trait, we're having a lot more conversations with the version of ourselves that might exist in the future. And a lot of the key to sort of getting your emotions under control is to be really in touch with who you are in the future. Because what that allows you to do is a couple of things, like recognize sort of what's that trade-off between short-term harm and long-term harm, or short-term harm and long-term good. You know, you can sort of think about how all those things are interacting. How do you sort of get to, how do I cause my behavior in the present to align with what the goals of the future version of me? So I feel like we're having these discussions with kind of ourselves all the time. And it's a natural, I know it's true of my sister, and I know it's true of my brother, that we spend just a lot of time thinking about, like, well, what's Thanksgiving going to be when we're 80? And I know that, like, when I talk to my kids and some horrible thing is happening, or they're really mad at me, I will always say, but imagine you're going to be able to tell your kids this when you're 40, and you're going to be able to talk about crazy grandma. And how awesome is that going to be? And I've been saying this to them, you know, since they were little.
So it sounds like what you're describing is that you imagined a future you, and you worked backwards and said, how am I going to start and get to that point?
Yeah.
Which is actually quite unusual. Most people, including I think myself, and the way I interact with the world is, I think about what's my next step,
right,
as opposed to what my step down the line is, and sort of work backwards to doing that.
Yeah, I kind of never live in that space. So I think about this sort of on a macro level and a micro level. So if I were to think about a micro level in terms of what I was doing in a poker hand, it was, what's this move, but with the goal of where am I trying to get in terms of what I'm doing against this player. So obviously it's compressed because the hand is over in 2 minutes. But what you're thinking about is you're thinking about what your goal is for the end of the hand, and then you're sort of working backwards to try to figure out what the path is to get you there. If you only think about what the next move is, what ends up happening is that you'll actually make moves that are very, very leverageable by your opponents. So the example that I would give would be, if you're trying to execute a bluff, the way that you play that hand must make sense. So in other words, if you try to execute a bluff, all the moves that you make to get you to the point where you might bluff must make sense for your hole cards actually being very strong. Now you'd be surprised. Almost no player actually makes a story that makes sense. What happens is they're kind of going along and they're like playing the hand in the way that you would expect if their hand wasn't that good. And then like last minute, they're like, oh, I'll just push my chips in, and they'll be scared of that. And a good player looks at that and says, you don't have anything, because
you would have played differently.
You would have played the hand differently. So even on a hand, you're trying to work backwards from what your goal is. So you're thinking you're thinking about multiple paths at once. Like, if my hand actually completes, what would I do? If it bluffs, if I have to bluff it, what would I do? What percentage of the time do I think I'll have to do that? How do I make sure that what I'm doing along the way is going to keep those paths open for me? So it's very future thinking. And then the other thing on the macro level was, if I am to actually be an effective learner in this game, then what I have to think about is, if I were to imagine myself in a year and I've gotten much better, what's the requirement for me to have done that? And the requirement is that I must spot the maximum number of mistakes that I possibly can. So what happens is that particular mindset of, if I am going to have actually improved, I must actually spot all of my errors, which includes, by the way, recognizing when another player is better than me. That's actually very hard for people to do in the moment. So one of the issues that happens when you have uncertainty in a game, particularly luck, is that it gives you an escape hatch to, in the moment, protect
yourself. Because
my identity.
Just luck, right?
It could be just luck. And very often the cards don't get shown at the end, and you don't really know, and you can cherry pick the data, because over the course of a session, there will certainly be some sort of hand that you played where you mathematically had the best of it and you ended up losing. So as you look back over the session, you can just pick those spots, and the spots where you got lucky fade into the background. The spots where you very often create the situation where you allow the person to get lucky to you against you because you don't end the hand early, as an example. There's all sorts of ways that you can kind of create a situation where it opens the player up to get lucky against you. There's all sorts of things that are happening. But what happens to players as they're processing that and just thinking about their next move is that when they lose, it's never their fault. It's always the other person was really bad and luck intervened in a way that I just did not like. It was bad luck. And they're very, very unlikely to think about the game through the lens of finding those situations actually to be really uninteresting.
Were you very systematic in doing it? So let me just recap what you said, which is really, really good advice to all the students out here, which I always tell them after they've taken one of my exams and they didn't do well. I always tell them, that's congratulations. Think of all those mistakes. They're opportunities to learn. And sometimes they don't take that advice so well. But I think it's what I'm hearing from you is the mistakes, and going back and finding them and addressing them is where you become better and where you can become that future version of yourself. But what I've heard from other panelists and experts in this is they say, but you have to be systematic about it.
Yes.
So when you were becoming an expert poker player, what ways were you systematic?
So basically what I was thinking about was, I was very lucky to have access to mentors. And I was very eager to be having conversations with the mentors. So the first thing is that I quickly got to a place, and this was with the help of some great mentors like Eric Seidel, I quickly got to a place where I just literally tried not to talk about the cases where I truly did get unlucky. I played the hand fine and I got unlucky, because if you think about it, those are very uninteresting. right? Okay, so it was the turn of a card. Like if we think about the things that we actually have control over in our lives, like the turn of the card is not one of them. And so if I spend my time obsessing about that, it actually doesn't help me in the future. But most poker players, by the way, that's exactly what they talk about. It's called a bad beat story. And that's what most of the talk is. Can you believe this guy? I had queens.
Because it doesn't reflect badly on them.
Right, exactly. So instead, what I was doing was thinking about, I'm going to have limited time with my mentors. I need to actually give them really good stuff. And I initially constrained myself to only talking to them about hands that I won where I felt like I had made a mistake. Now, why did I do that in particular? Because hands that you won, we don't like to explore. This is actually the most, if we think about a 2x2, right? If we think about the 4 quadrants of a 2x2, we've got good decision, good outcome, good decision, bad outcome. So that's the bad beat story, right? Good, bad decision.
Good outcome.
Good outcome.
We usually ignore those.
Right, because we don't want to actually explore that. And then bad decision, bad outcome. So poker players deny the existence of the last quadrant, bad decision, bad outcome. But what happens is that as you're thinking about the good outcomes, if you think about it from, are you sort of like free rolling or not, right? If I have a bad outcome, I'm kind of free rolling by exploring the bad outcome because I already feel really bad. So maybe I can find out that actually I made good decisions and I got lucky. So now I win to that.
So there's no downside.
There's no downside. That's what a free roll is, no downside. Yeah. So I'm already in a bad place. I lost. I feel crappy. So I'm perfectly happy naturally to explore the bad outcomes because maybe I can find luck in there and find a way out of feeling bad about myself. But think about the reverse. If I really deeply explore good outcomes, now it's called a negative free roll, which means there's no upside. I mean, at least not in the moment, right? So identity-wise, there's no upside unless you're really thinking about the version of you in a year, because there's a lot of upside to that person. There's just not upside to the person right now. So the systematic thing that I did in the beginning was really focus on hands that I won. And really say, that's what I'm going to talk to my mentors about, is hands that I won. And try to figure out, could I have won more? Did I make a mistake? Did I actually play the hand poorly? And this was a really important thing. Maybe I made good decisions, and maybe I had a good outcome, but did I maximize?
Right.
Now I'm turning a big win into a loss, right? Now I'm turning I made good decisions and I had a good outcome, and somehow I'm making that in the moment a loss. But what a big win for me in the long run. So this was with a lot of help of the mentors, being accountable to them, having them shut me down on the bad beat stories. That was really, really important. So that's external pressure on my thinking. And then me doing this super systematic thing of like really focusing on the good outcomes.
That's interesting. So I want to actually change the topic a little bit from poker. One of the things you do, Annie, now is you're a kind of a corporate consultant in helping them make good decisions. So this is a sports analytics session. So let's turn our attention to football. I've learned a little bit about football over the years hosting Moneyball. It's never been my sport, but I'm becoming more interested. But I did watch some football the other day. There was a game on last Sunday, and I was just confounded by the terrible decision making by the coaches, at least based on the understanding that I've had. So at dinner last night, and I heard it again at the football analytics panel, there was the question, why do they make such bad decisions? And the answer that Aaron Schatz gave for me, he's from Football Outsiders, was they don't believe in probability. There's no chance in a football coach's universe. And this is a quandary that I don't think I could get past. So if you were coming to be a consultant and you're trying to explain to a football organization how they have to start making better decisions, how would you approach this problem?
Oh, that's a pretty broad.
It is. Well, we could talk about, say, that 4th down and 1 decision. So actually, what I learned was the way they view it is that there isn't any chance, there's just a play. And they either have the right play or the wrong play. And if it doesn't come out well, they had the wrong play. And if it came out right, they had the right play. It seems that they're falling into almost all the traps. Yes, maybe you can tell us about that.
So I'm going to maybe take this in a slightly different place than you're expecting, but let me try to do this. So generally, there's this thing that we do that's called resulting, which is we feel like if we know the quality of the outcome, then we know what we need to know about the underlying decision making. So we could take like the famous Pete Carroll play that I opened my book with, where he passes the ball on 2nd and 1 with 26 seconds left in the whole game against the Patriots. Is everybody familiar with that play? So obviously it gets intercepted. And there's some great headlines from the next day, including USA Today calling it the worst play in NFL history. That was pretty awesome. And you look through those, and to your point, there's no probability in them at all. So it's just kind of taken as like received wisdom that clearly this was a terrible play call. Now, I'm sure this crowd is much more familiar than most, but this was actually quite a good play call. There was a blown coverage. I mean, there was other stuff, but that has nothing to do with Pete Carroll, right? He's just looking at what the probabilities are at the time. And I think that in general, people have a hard time understanding, if something's, in this particular case, if something is 2% to occur, that you will actually observe that outcome 2% of the time, which was the actual probability of the interception there. Just FYI, the pass also allowed you to get three tries at the end zone instead of 2, which is, as we know, no small thing. But if we think about it, like if I were to actually walk you through what that decision tree is, it would take me a long time to explain it to you. And certainly if I were a regular fan, I got to teach them some options theory. I've got to explain to them how often Marshawn Lynch is actually going to score in that situation, which is actually only about 20% of the time, so on and so forth. So this is complicated. So instead we use a shortcut, and we say if I know what the quality of the outcome is, then I shall know what the quality of the decision is. Now, what's very interesting about resulting is that it only occurs in situations where the decision quality is hidden from view. In other words, where there's opacity. Right? So the Pete Carroll example is a good example. If Pete Carroll had handed this ball off to Marshawn Lynch and failed to score that way, everybody would have just talked about how good Belichick is. So it would have gone off of his plate and onto the plate of stuff that he couldn't control. In other words, the Patriots are just too good. Now, what's the difference between those two plays? In one case, there's consensus. In one case, people feel like they know. You don't need to explain it to me. We just know you're supposed to hand it off to Marshawn Lynch. So when you fail in kind of a usual way, we allow luck to suddenly show through. We recognize the uncertainty in the relationship between outcome quality and decision quality. And now it's just like, tough luck, what could you do? But when you pass, bad beat in poker. Right. Yeah. When you pass the ball there, which nobody is expecting, now what happens is that depending on how that works out, the reaction gets incredibly polarized. So when you win by handing it off to Marshawn Lynch, it's like, good job. When you lose by handing it off to Marshawn Lynch, it's like, bad luck, what could you do? But when you win by passing, you are now a genius. And we know that from the Philly special. And you can do the thought experiment. What if he passes the ball there and they defeat the evil Patriots, right? Like everybody's saying he's the greatest coach ever. Right? But if you lose that way, he gets called an idiot, which some of the outlets actually did. So this brings me to the very bad decision-making of coaches. And so I'm going to give you another explanation for why they play badly. As human beings walking around in the world, we all know this. We know that when you do something consensus, when you do something that people kind of feel like they understand, that you will be off the hook for a bad outcome. But when you do something that people sort of feel like they don't quite understand, you will be on the hook for a bad outcome. Go through a green light, get in an accident, no one cares, right? It's like, too bad. All right, so let's think about this now from a football coach's perspective. If I go for it on 4th down in a situation that isn't well understood, right? And something bad happens, like I lose the game, or I don't advance it. Like let's take something that the analytics tell you really should do. Let's say you're on your own 1-yard line, and it's 4th down with like 1 yard to go. We know that mathematically you should actually go for it there. But what if you don't and you give the other players, the other team, the ball on the 1-yard line? So you actually go for it. You make that weird choice, and it
Huge
fails.
Downside.
Everybody's telling you you're an idiot. Just like everybody's going to tell you're an idiot if you pull the goalie in hockey with 6 minutes left. Or in soccer with if you're doing an onside kick with 6 minutes left in football, when those things fail, you get called an idiot. So coaches know that. Like human beings know that. They might not be able to express it to you, but they know that. So the reason why we know they know that is this. When they don't go for it, even though the analytics tell them they should, they always cite things like momentum wasn't going my way, the running back wasn't finding the hole, the line wasn't holding today. They give you all of these things that sound like reasonable reasons why, even though the analysts said we should go it, they were like, no, we did it. What you never get is the other direction.
So how do you change a culture? So how would you imagine trying to get someone who's just done that for all these reasons, and you now try to explain to them that's not a good way to approach your decision making? You cannot think about, I mean, obviously the downside, the asymmetric loss is there. That's not going to change. And one of the things that we hear in sports is that a coach won't really change their behaviors unless they have complete support up and down the system.
Right, so that would be thing number one.
Yeah.
Thing number two is that you can get into Belichick's situation where you win 2 Super Bowls, and then people just start questioning you, stop questioning you. So what's interesting with Belichick, obviously his decision making is not as good as it used to be, but there was this period where he was really...
Obviously, right?
Well, to this room. I say to this room.
Oh, I agree.
Ever since he got, and it's since he got really, really criticized for that 4th and 5. Which was correct, but you notice he's even vulnerable to this problem. Like, criticize me enough, and I'm like, I'm already in the Hall of Fame. I don't need to take this, right? But in that in-between period when he was doing so amazing, he actually, before he won the 2 Super Bowls, if you look at his decision-making, he does other things that are great. But as far as the analytics were concerned, he was no great shakes. It was in that in-between, it was in that middle period that he was doing, like, amazingly. Why? Because if we go back to this idea of transparency, people just, if Belichick did it, it must be good. If Belichick did it, it must be going through a green light. So you can get sort of like this aura of like everybody will accept what you do anyway, which frees you up. So the first thing is you need support up and down the organization. The second thing is you need to educate your fans. You need to create identity around the idea that we do things differently here. Now we know from Hinkie that that's really hard to do. I have not seen someone do a better job than Hinkie did of educating the fans.
Oh, they're educated now, not when he was here, but
right. Now they're educated.
Yeah,
Why?
right.
Because it turned out well.
Turned out well.
But when they were here, they started saying "trust the process" as an insult.
That's right.
Right. So
it's an anthem here in Philadelphia,
right.
by the way.
He did a very good job of educating the fans, and even so, because it didn't realize fast enough, you know, we all know Hinkie's no longer with the Sixers.
Right.
So, you know, this is a really, really tough nut to crack. And I think that there's this quandary of you're going to do a lot better particularly if you get the owner to buy in, which is I think where a lot of the tension is with ownership. You're definitely going to do a lot better there. You're going to do a lot better with educated fans. And then you have to change the process with which you're actually making decisions with the organization, which starts to come to how do you get the coaches to say, we're actually going to kind of ignore luck and ignore the outcome in some way. And that's completely, you just have to run your meetings differently. And I don't see organizations doing a lot of that.
Right. One of the things that is really important to me as a statistician is trying to help people understand how to use data properly to overwhelm what I consider to be inevitable cognitive biases that all of us possess.
Right.
One of my favorite quotes is from Richard Feynman, who warned the graduating class of Caltech that as you go out into the world, remember you not to fool yourself because you are the most easiest person to fool of all. And I try to think that there's a set of skills that we try to teach and impart to our students to help them not do that. So what do you think is if you had to pick the number one challenge that we would overcome, what would it be in making good decisions?
Within sports in particular?
Not necessarily, just in making good decisions.
Yeah, so the number one challenge is this. I call it the paradox of experience. Is that experience is necessary for learning, but experience can interfere with learning. And I think this is the biggest challenge that we have, is that experience in the aggregate is amazing for learning, to your point, right? But we don't really understand the aggregate, right? We don't sit back as decision makers and say, hold on, let me actually not really update my prior too much based off one data point, and let me hold off a second until I've got more going for me. And it's just not naturally the way that our minds work. And so what happens is that we get these very big overreactions to particular outcomes. And then the other thing is that we have all sorts of biased ways in which we're processing those outcomes. So while we need experience to learn, it's actually mostly interfering, weirdly enough, with the learning process. So we need to figure out a way as decision makers to sort of step back out from under the shadow of a single outcome or even a small subset of outcomes in order to get to good decision making. Now there's a few things that you can do about this. One of the best things you can do is that when you're eliciting feedback from somebody, to actually separate fact from opinion and get them into the same state of knowledge that you were in at the time that you were making the decision. So if I can use a poker example to explain this, there's all sorts of things that have to do with my own opinion. My own opinion, for example, would be the choices that I made with the hand. That's a matter of my opinion, right? So
what do you mean by the choices?
So you raise in
Early
front
in
of
the-
me.
yeah.
You raise in front of
Okay.
me, and I have ace queen. Whatever I choose to do with that hand is my opinion. It is not a fact, right? So if
It's your judgment based on what you
right,
the
which is
player
my
and-
opinion,
yeah, okay.
right? So this is not an objective. It's just not in the objective fact category. Now, if I am trying to elicit feedback from you, what people will generally do when they're eliciting feedback is they will throw in all sorts of things about their own opinion, and they will also throw in how it actually turned out, because they consider that to be very, very important data points. Like, I possess special knowledge, and if I don't impart that special knowledge to Professor Wyner, then all of a sudden he won't actually be able to give me good advice because I haven't imparted my special knowledge. So in poker, the way that players elicit feedback about poker was, you raised in front of me, I tell you some things about you, like, are you aggressive or not aggressive, whatever. I give all the, I give facts about you, but then I say, and so I looked down at ace queen and I re-raised him, and then he did this back, and then the board came in ace and nine and three, and he checked to me, and I bet, and he did this, and da-da-da, and then in the end, he turned over his hand, and he had ace king. What do you think I should have done? And you shouldn't even ask at that point.
It's too late.
It's too late. I've ruined you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I literally just put you deeply into the gravity well of the outcome, and I've also infected you with my own opinion. So if I really want to get good feedback from you, what I need to do is this. Hey, I played a hand with somebody. They entered the pot about 25% of the time. They were quite aggressive.
This is the information
This
you
is
would
facts.
possess at the time
This is
of
facts.
the decision. Yeah.
They had won the last three hands, so on and so forth. This is the way they perceived me, blah, blah, blah. So I give you all those facts. They raised in front of me, and I looked down at ace queen. What do you think I should do? Now, I know what I did. I know what my opinion is, but I just don't give you any of it. And you can think about how you can translate this into football as well, right? So it was for, let's take the Pete Carroll thing. I say it was 2nd and 1. We had 26 seconds left and 1 timeout. We were down by 4. It's the 4th quarter. And I have to figure out what to do. What play do you think I should run? Now, when I do that, a couple of things are going to happen. One is you're going to give me a less biased opinion. 2, you're not going to be swung around by the outcome. Now I can actually get you to not think that a pass play is bad because it happened not to work out, right? I can actually get a purer version of your opinion.
I also might ask some questions.
Sure, and I will
flesh it out a
answer
little
them
bit.
with facts. If
Right.
you say, well, this used to happen to me in poker all the time. I would ask advice of somebody, and I would do exactly what I did. So I'd ace queen, what do you think I should do? They'd go, well, what did you do? And the reason that they're doing that is they're afraid to disagree with me. But that's exactly what I want. So the point is, if you want to learn, you actually in some ways have to pull yourself back from the actual experience of your life and build on the experience of others in order to get there. So what I'm trying to do in the way that I'm communicating to get feedback is to expose as much dispersion of opinion as I possibly can. I want to know when you disagree with me. This is a hard thing for people to sort of embrace. But my whole life is, how do I find out when someone disagrees with me? Because that is when I get to learn.
When they disagree with you. In fact, one of the things that we always talk about in education is that the way we make decisions and come to reality is actually espouse the position on the other side and attack it as best as you possibly can.
Right. So I find it, honestly, I find it very uninteresting when someone agrees with me. I think that that's super uninteresting. It's not exciting to me. And if you think about the way that people interact with each other, whether you're in a sports organization or whatever, it's all a bunch of people parenting their beliefs back to them. And we all feel pretty good about that. You know, I mean, if we had a political discussion, I found out you agreed with me, I'd come around way like, oh, look at me. But I'm more excited when someone disagrees with me.
But there has to be a confidence that disagreeing would not end up in a catastrophe. So that's actually quite important, that that this is what we talk about the organization. If there has to be an environment where people can disagree and let it be friendly.
Right. So part of the way to do that is a couple things.
Avoid Twitter.
Avoid Twitter for sure. There's two ways to make disagreement sort of part of the culture in a way that it becomes very agreeable. The first is to make it so that someone's not disagreeing with the room. Mm-hmm. So most of the time that we're making decisions in a team framework, meaning like the coaches would be a team, right?
Right.
We're actually making those decisions in the room. And so if someone wants to disagree, they must actually go against what the consensus in the room is. If, as your first pass, you elicit the feedback from each individual separately, so in other words, like email you what their opinion is, and now you put that together in an anonymized package, it's a much more friendly way to find out that people disagree with you. And by the way, much more effective than having the conversation in the room. That's number one. Number two is we know that people like to feel cohesively part of a group. So how do we actually use that to our advantage? Well, think about what I did with my mentors.
That does not lead to disagreement, being cohesive.
Well, it can, if the cohesion of the group is around acceptance of disagreement, which is what happened with my mentors. So I would listen to other players all talking to each other about how great they were and how stupid all the people they had played against were. Not everybody, by the way. I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating. And I would go up, and my group would be talking about all the bad plays they had made. Now I get to feel like I'm part of a group, but I've changed sort of what the epistemology of the group is in terms of what it is that we believe is important. Now, the other thing you can do, which is actually really good, is to perform pre-mortems. These are team games about pre-mortems, about disagreeing.
You explain what pre-mortem is?
Yeah, so on a team, you come in on Monday, and you figure out why things went wrong. Mm-hmm. All the things that went wrong, you talk about them after the fact. Well, I've already told you, if we already know it went wrong, it's probably not going to be the greatest discussion ever.
No. Right.
But what I like to do is get to the patient before it dies. Mm-hmm. And the way to do that is to say, imagine it's Monday and we lost the game. Imagine it's Monday and we gained 20% fewer yards than what we expected to do. Imagine it's Monday and we were well above what we expected in terms of interceptions or turnovers.
Before it actually happens.
Before it actually happens. You're doing this on like Wednesday. Mm-hmm. And everybody separately, again, you don't talk about this out loud, everybody separately on a piece of paper writes down up to 5 reasons. A mix of things that have to do with your own decision making or luck. And now those get put together in a whole list, and now you have a conversation about them. This allows someone to be a really good member of the team and also think more in sort of more of the negative space, because the negative space is where all the learning lives, honestly. So it allows...
While it's still being theoretical.
Well, it's still being theoretical. So this is like a really wonderful way, because like now, how am I the best team player on the team? Well, I'm the one who comes up with the most creative and interesting way that we might fail. I'm the one who has a way we might fail that nobody else has on their list, right? So this allows you to kind of disagree with the group in a way where you are being a really good and productive member of the group. So you can kind of flip that idea of what does it mean to be a team on its head.
Remarkable. We only have 1 or 2 minutes left, but I did want to save a few moments to ask the audience if they have any questions. Annie has a wealth of amazing experience, so I'm always interested to hear what people are interested in at the end. Yes?
You mentioned at the beginning that you probably not do as well against a very top of players because you're out of practice. From an outside, as a fan perspective, it feels like this is not a physical sport, so practice should be as big of a component. Are you talking about the mental aspect of things, or are you talking about the retroactive?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that themselves.
Yeah,
Has the game changed a lot? Do they know a lot more than they used to?
Yeah, so it's twofold. One is that you do actually have to be in practice, because you are essentially building models of your opponents all the time. And some of that, you have to do that very quickly. You don't get to go back and you have to do that in the moment. And so kind of the more you're playing, obviously, the better you are in the moment at building those models, right? So that's number one, is that I think I'd just be a step behind. But the second thing is that when I started playing, we were sort of working out the math by hand, like I'm not kidding. Mm-hmm. Now people can run these really amazing simulations, right? They have these solvers. Now they're finding out now, as you always do with analytics, that the solvers actually don't solve it. They give you different things that you could have done.
Right.
And
Well,
now
they
you sort of
also-
have to figure out
You
among
also have
those.
inputs that you have to put
Right.
in. And
So people were thinking that the solvers were like the word of God for a long time, and now they're actually pulled back from that. I never thought that because I was sort of playing at a time where you knew that that couldn't possibly be the case. Because it matters what you're inputting, it matters what your assumptions are, and even if it does come out, it matters what you're saying about the tendency of your opponent, right? But I do know that even so, how much these players now are deep down in these analytics, and how many plays that they've sort of identified that I would have, from my hand doing, thought weren't really effective plays, that wouldn't be positive expected value, that they've sort of uncovered, that unless I took a lot of time to really sort of dig down on what the analytics are telling you today, because I am now almost 8 years out of date, that would be a steep curve that I'd have to get back up on top of. But luckily I'm not playing anymore, so I don't need to.
you need to do that, yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have another question? Yes. Right there. Yep.
So you see sort of the best players in the game right now are sort of playing pretty much game theory optimal. When it sort of evolves that like essentially every player is sort of playing that way, what's going to be the differentiator among the best players?
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, first of all, I don't think that will ever happen, number one. And then let me come to number three. But number two is going to be the emotional stuff. That it doesn't matter if you know what GTO is. That's just game theory optimal. It doesn't matter if you know what the GTO play is. If you don't actually execute on it, it's not going to matter. So that was the point I was making about, like, you really, in poker in particular, you really have to get your emotions under control, because things happen to you that are not in your control, that are really, really bad all the time. And you're losing, you lose a lot of money because those bad things happen. And so, it's like, what do you know and what are you executing on are two separate things, right? So that's kind of number two. The number three thing that I would say is what's really interesting is that even with game theory optimal, you still want to understand that sometimes you're supposed to pull back on that and play an exploitative strategy. So what I saw from a lot of players that were coming off online, where you're playing 20 tables, and so you would never be exploitative because you can't pay enough attention to each individual player, is that they would come into a cash game and play GTO when they should have been playing exploitative. So all that means is that, for example, let's say that I can grab a coin, and I could grab a 90-10 coin or a 80-20 coin or whatever, and if we're playing game theory optimal, we should just both be grabbing the 50-50 coin. Because if I were to grab an 80-20 coin, you would adjust
figure it
right
out.
away.
But GTO optimal can only be calculated if everybody's GTO optimal.
That's right, exactly.
Once everyone deviates from that, it becomes
then you have to
an
play
unsolvable
exploitative.
problem. Yeah.
Right, so now what I want to do is, if I know that if I grab an 80-20 coin that you're not going to notice anymore, it's really bad if I'm defaulting to the 50-50 coin just in case he's game theory optimal, right? I need to very quickly be grabbing that 80-20 coin and recognize that he won't adjust. So I did see that was actually a big problem with players that were coming off online when I was still playing into a live game, is that they weren't exploiting enough. Which, of course, in the 90s, that's all we were doing. We understood what game theory optimal was, but other people didn't, so you were just looking for the exploitative strategy all the time. Exploitative sounds so bad in that situation,
it
but
makes
it's
a lot
not,
of sense.
yeah.
Yeah. I think we should thank Annie for coming
Yes,
and
Thank you.
thank you so much. Carly?